So the topic that I'm going to be talking about in today's presentation is about digital trade and the new imperialism. So to give an introduction of what I've been researching about in this paper, I've been essentially discussing about the WTO liberalization works that have been taking place under the Joint Statement Initiative with regards to liberalization of e-commerce. I talk about the Joint Statement Initiative, which is a primary platform for negotiation of international e-commerce regulation, which is currently ongoing in at the WTO level. I think Dr. Sandeep also talked about this in his presentation about how a group of 71 countries earlier and now 91 countries have come together in order to negotiate international trade rules relating to digital trade or e-commerce specifically. In the JSI, there have been negotiations which have been taking place since 2019. And in 2024, in the July of 2024, there was a stabilized text which has been come out with the conveners of the negotiations have come out with the stabilized text, which essentially talks about broadly what the negotiations have been conducted about and what are the potential rules that the countries are favoring and what they would be voting upon at the time of adopting those negotiated rules. So to talk a little bit about the scope of the JSI negotiations itself, based on the stabilized agreement that we have, which was released in July of 2024, we have four broad issues when the negotiations started, there was a lot of importance or there was a lot of concentration, which was on a couple of issues. For instance, one of them was a permanent e-commerce moratorium. As you all may know, that whenever there is international trade in goods taking place across borders, at the border level, there is something called as a tariff, which is imposed on the goods, which are in the form of taxes. However, in case of e-commerce, where if the trading of commodities is taking place based on an online marketplace, or when the trade in goods is taking place not by the physical transportation of goods, but by virtue of converting those goods into intangible products and then trading in them, in both these ways of carrying out international e-commerce, there is currently no mechanism for imposing a tariff. The reason why this tariff is impossible to be imposed is due to the confusion that e-commerce poses, in the sense that it acts like a disruptive technology which cannot fit in the existing framework of the WTO agreements unless there is a way which is negotiated upon for that. So, in order to ensure that the countries are not using the tariff imposition on e-commerce in a wrongful manner, over the period of time, there has been something called as an e-commerce moratorium, which has been accepted and imposed by the members of the WTO. And one of the issues in the JSI stabilized text has been to make this e-commerce moratorium permanent, which means that there will be no tariffs imposed on e-commerce, which takes place at a cross-border level between countries. The second way, thereby liberalizing e-commerce in the sense that the barriers to trade are reduced to a significant level. The second issue which has been discussed about is with respect to enabling e-commerce. Now, enabling e-commerce is another aspect of the GSI stabilized text, which talks about certain infrastructural capabilities which need to be advanced in order to carry out a liberal trade of digital goods. For instance, one of the things which is included in this chapter of the GSI negotiation has been to recognize electronic contracts or to recognize electronic signatures to ensure that electronic transactions are taking place in a manner that all the countries are recognizing it and all the countries are recognizing it at the same level, thereby again pushing for a liberalized method of carrying out international trade in e-commerce. The third way that the GSI stabilized text has brought in the aspect of liberalized digital trade has been by talking about the access and use of the internet for e-commerce. Out here again, it talks about how there has to be improved access to internet because internet forms one of the most basic raw materials for the purpose of carrying out e-commerce. And lastly, one of the issues which has been discussed in the JSI negotiations, which is not necessarily about liberalization of trade per se, but it nonetheless is very important for the point of our discussion that we are going to have today, is the rules with respect to development. Now, rules with respect to development, ideally, a person might imagine that these development related rules would be relating to the digital divide which exists between the population of the world. There is a digital divide which exists between people, there is a digital divide which exists between countries as well. So there was a lot of hope from this development chapter of the GSI stabilized text, considering that it should talk about what is to be done about the digital divide that exists between countries. However, the development chapter in the stabilized text does not talk about digital divide at all. It talks about one, giving an extended period of time for developing countries and least developed countries in order to implement the regulations which are accepted under the GSI negotiations. And second of all, it talks about or it recognizes the fact that there are some countries, especially developing countries and the LDCs, which might require some kind of a capacity building support or technological support in order to bring in e-commerce as a normal part of their digital economy. However, it does not impose any severe or strict obligations on the countries to ensure that development takes place along with a liberalized e-commerce framework. It simply talks about an extension of period of time for implementation of the agreement, which in light of the complex nature of digital divide which exists seems very superficial and incomplete. The issue that arises out of these GSI negotiations is the fact that digital trade or international e-commerce has been of such a nature that it has to a very great extent disrupted the manner in which e-commerce or in which international trade takes place generally. In 1994, when we had the WTO, which was established, the essential agreements that we had were limited to goods, trade and goods here included physical goods and trade and services, which essentially included the intangible aspect of it. However, with the growing advancement in technology, now we have certain goods which portray characteristics of a service, and we have certain services which portray characteristics of goods, and it becomes very difficult to consider them as two separate things. And that is one of the challenges which are posed by e-commerce generally. In addition to this, digital divide or difference in the technological development between countries is something that is of a huge concern and needs to be addressed to a very great extent. There are multiple other concerns concerning digital trade or e-commerce, such as environmental concerns, because most of the digital trade is carried out by companies which have huge physical infrastructure in order to support the digital technologies that they develop, which ends up affecting the environment to a very great extent. It also includes various aspects such as data privacy, in the sense how exactly will digital trade ensure that private data of individuals who are participating in the digital economy does not get misused by the people who are engaging in digital trade. There are multiple facets to digital trade, which essentially requires an in-depth, a detailed study to be conducted, not just in a certain type of countries, such as developed countries, but across all the countries where the background of the countries is different from a digital economy perspective. And only after a thorough study has been conducted can ideal rules be concluded at the international level. However, at the WTO, the only two advances which has happened in the area of regulation of digital trade has been first a work program which was established in the year 1997, which essentially intended to undertake exploratory work relating to digital trade. Now, this work program, which was set up, essentially intended to understand digital trade, intended to address the problem of digital divide, and then go ahead and probably in the future discuss the ways to regulate aspects of digital trade. However, over the period of time, especially after the Doha round of negotiations, which led to a lot of struggle between countries with respect to their individual interests, the work program's functioning was severely affected. And in the backdrop of a failing work program on e-commerce is where the JSI was proposed by the 71 countries. So JSI essentially initiated out of a failure of the work program, which shows that the work program which was set up to carry out the exploratory work to understand digital trade and then propose rules relating to it was never done at all, was never completed. And before completing that aspect, before completing the aspect of exploration of problems that might happen in digital trade, the JSI negotiations began, which talked about concluding regulations in order to liberalize digital trade. So the problems of digital trade or the concerns which various countries may face or interests of various countries was never taken into consideration before GSI negotiations began. Now, normally when GSI negotiations began, there was a general understanding that all the countries will be able to participate equally in the negotiations and put forth their individual interest in order to have a very well-rounded set of regulation. However, at the international level, due to difference in bargaining power of the countries, that has not been happening to a very great extent. So we still have a lot of proposals which were put forth by the developing countries, which does not reflect in the JSI stabilized text at all. The stabilized text, more importantly, talks about liberalization of trade and does not talk about how exactly do countries want to protect their interests when it comes to digital trade. There is also the aim of this research is also to raise caution against implanting the northern policies in the sense policies of the developed countries in the context of developing an LDCs, because developing countries and least developed countries have a completely different context in which digital trade functions. In this backdrop, I intend to look at digital trade from a colonial perspective in order to understand the manner in which digital trade takes place and in order to understand the ways in which this trade can affect the interest of the developing and the least developed countries from a colonial perspective. So the first thing that I want to talk about here is the problem of digital trade. In fact, all of these are various problems which exist in digital trade, and then we'll go on to talk about further problems which may be looked into from a much more specific purpose. However, one of the problems of digital trade has been an issue called as adverse incorporation, in the sense that one of the proponents or one of the proposals in order to support an argument for liberalization of digital trade has been that the more liberalized digital trade becomes, the better positions of the countries to improve their digital economy. For instance, if a country is not allowing for free trade of computers, their own people will not have access to computers. Or if a country is resisting e-commerce, their own people will not have access to various platforms which offer e-commerce services. So one of the arguments to act in favor of liberalization of digital trade is to talk about how liberalization is actually going to improve the digital status of individual countries. However, it misses a major point, which is the point of adverse incorporation, in the sense that even if we go ahead and liberalize trade, digital trade in various countries, it definitely will have an impact on the digital capabilities of that country. However, the incorporation of that country's population in the digital uh, economy is going to act as an adverse impact on their development, in the sense that even if in a country digital trade is liberalized and more people are participating in digital trade, one of the major problems which will come up eventually is going to be how all these participants are participating as mere consumers and have absolutely no capabilities to use those digital technologies in a production capacity or in the capacity of actually having an output based digital incorporation. So, this would result in an adverse incorporation where, being a part of the digital economy, I'm only participating as a consumer or as somebody who's dependent on digital technologies for my needs, but I'm not able to participate actively as a producer or as a person who can generate output out of my participation in the digital sphere. Second problem that exists with respect to liberalization of digital trade has been the imperialist policies which have been followed by global tech giants. And the next slide that I'll be discussing about talks about various ways in which the global tech giants undertake imperialist policies and how exactly it affects the developing and the least developed countries' model of development. We also have issues with respect to the fact that considering the digital economy or the digital sphere of trading is something which is completely new and completely different, where most of the stakeholders are unregulated and most of the market also is unregulated, we have multiple customs of trade and customs of businesses which are created by global tech giants who currently control the most of the digital economy. And these new customs, which are developed by them in the trade, are one sided and they only support their own interests and do not take into consideration the interests in a overall manner. The next problem with respect to unregulated or with respect to liberalization of digital trade is the fact that the entirety of the digital economy, right from data privacy till the competition between global tech giants and including the consumer protection aspect of digital trade, everything is unregulated in majority of the states. But if we accept something like the JSI negotiation, which provides for liberalization of free trade, we are going to have a very opposing situation where the entire economy would be unregulated, except the part where you will not be able to carry out trade in a non-liberalized manner. So having regulation for liberalization while not having regulations to ensure that the problems that may arise from liberalization are not taken care of is a major dichotomy which exists in majority of the countries, which is also one of the reasons why most of the developing and least developed countries have not participated in the JSI negotiations, probably considering the fact that they are not in a position to understand the entire space. And more importantly, they may not be in a position to suggest policies or interests which are in their favor. Another problem with respect to liberalization of free trade is the existence of GAFM companies. Now, GAFM companies are basically a set of companies which control majority of the digital market across the globe. So currently we have under the GAFM companies Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, and all of them together account for around $3 trillion of market capital across the globe. Uh, these these GAFM companies essentially control major areas of internet activities such as search engines and browsers, digital operating systems in phones and laptops, office softwares, remote cloud storage services, social networking, transportation, communication, streaming of videos, online advertisements. So nearly all areas of the internet activities are controlled by these GAFM companies, which are just five companies, controlling majority of the market capital in the digital sphere across the globe. And they are essentially controlling all the policies which are being adopted in the digital sphere. And most of the policies, again, will be something that I'll be talking about in the next couple of slides. So the concentration of the research that I'm talking about is essentially relating to the questionable practices which are undertaken by these global tech giants and how these questionable practices could be controlled by the policies developed by countries. But if we have a liberalization mandate under the WTO to liberalize digital trade, maybe the countries will lose their policy space to undertake certain policies for regulating these questionable practices which are undertaken by the global tech giants. With respect to the imperialist policies in digital economy, which is essentially the policies undertaken by the global tech giants, I essentially have around 5 points talking about what could be considered as indicators of imperialism. And then I'll go on to talk about how these global tech giants, through their individual policies, as to how they carry out the functioning of their companies, lead to imperialism by these global tech giants. For instance, a few indicators of imperialism could be, first of all, the fact that there is a boom in production. So earlier it was the industrial revolution. Now we have a boom in all these digital products which are in place. And the need for these people who are undergoing the process of industrialization, or right now we are undergoing a process of technological development, the need for these people to search for newer markets, which is one of the major indicators which began the entire colonial history of the world as well. The second indicator of imperialism could be considered as the colonial powers taking away the economic power over resources and means of production from the natives, which was something, especially if we look at it from the context of the East India Company and India, we have situations where in the past the companies have taken away economic power, which is something that I will be proposing the global tech giants are also doing. The third indicator of imperialism could be considered as improved infrastructure for profit maximization. So even though we had the colonial powers build infrastructure models in their colonies, most of this infrastructure was built in order to support their own profit maximization. Again, something which is being done by global tech giants by offering the various services that they offer. The next one is extraction of resources from the colonies. In the digital aspect, the extraction of resources could be in the form of extraction of data. And lastly, social, economic, and political control of colonies. Again, something which is possible due to the data extraction and also due to data processing, which is being carried out by the companies that I was talking about. Now, these imperialist policies, which are undertaken by the global tech giants, have in fact covered almost all the indicators that I have discussed about. So how do these global tech giants have these imperialist policies in place? They have a control over software, they have a control over hardware, and they do it through their IPR policies. To talk about a little bit of all of these, I have the next slide, which essentially discusses specific things which are done by these global tech giants, which can be considered as forwarding the imperialist policies in various countries. For instance, the first one is the problem of digital divide and technology as access, right? For this, I'd like to exemplify this with the Facebook Free Basics plan, which it had in the near past come up with. Now, the Free Basics plan was basically Facebook offering free access to certain websites to the population. So, the Free Basic plan was in fact adopted in Africa, where most of the Africans were able to access certain websites without any access to internet or without having paid for an internet data package, right? Now, on the face of it, this seems like a policy which is adopted for technology access, right? Many of these people in Africa who may not have access to internet are now able to access certain websites which otherwise they would not have been able to access, which is improved access. However, the problem that lies here is with respect to the fact that most of this technological access, which was granted by Facebook, was first of all heavily controlled by Facebook, which means I will be able to access only those websites which Facebook wants me to access or allows me to access. So there goes my capability to look at it from the perspective of a person who is accessing technology. And in addition to this, because of the digital divide which exists between the people in Africa versus the people in a developed country, the people in Africa may be able to access the technology in a very limited manner, which will not extend to the manner in which technology is accessed in developed countries, which exists due to the existing divide between the two countries. So that is one of the major policies, questionable policies, which were undertaken by the global tech giants in the form of Facebook. Second one is the fact that most of these companies have an immense power over software which is developed by them. So again, even if we liberalize digital trade, even if we allow people of various countries to have access to, let's say, social networking websites such as Instagram or Facebook, we would still have the problem of software control, in the sense the software would be majorly controlled by the companies and not by us. So we would be active users of various social networking websites without having any control over what kind of access we want to give with respect to our data, or without having any control over how we want to access these websites in the first place, because the entire software control is in the hand of the company. Next one is impact on digital backwardness. Because of the fact that most of these aspects have been digitalized now, the traditional markets which would have existed in these developing countries would now be washed off due to the fact that now digital market is something which is coming into picture. So the erstwhile opportunities of earning money or raising capital which existed in the developing countries would now be completely unavailable, or would be reduced to a greater extent due to the advent of digital economy without taking care of the digital divide which exists between people. Another policy which is undertaken by global tech giants is centralized cloud control and forced cloud dependency. Now, having an option to store my data on the cloud is not a problem, but reducing my hardware's capacity to have enough memory, thereby forcing me to upload my content on the cloud, is the problem here. Which is why the problem is not just centralized cloud control, but it's also the fact that in order to push people towards relying on centralized cloud control, the hardware is being designed in such a manner that there is no option with the user but to rely on cloud control on the centralized cloud for processing and storing of their data. The next problem is difference in treatment. For instance, most of these global tech giants want a complete control over how their intellectual property rights are being treated in various countries, while at the same time not giving the same level of protection to digital data privacy, which is of the consumers. So we have two interests here. One is the interest of the global tech giant, which is in the form of the intellectual property the rights that they have, and the second interest is in the form of data privacy, which is the interest of the consumers and the users of these global tech giants, who would want protection of their data privacy. So these two interests are being dealt with by the global tech giants in such an opposing way that they would want maximum protection for their rights, which is intellectual property. However, they would want the minimum or the least amount of restriction on the rights of others, which is in the form of digital privacy. So this dichotomy of treatment of two very important aspects of the digital economy is something which is a huge problem, and it falls within that questionable policies followed by global tech giants. The last two are, in fact, to a certain extent related. Digital surveillance, which is again something carried out by global tech giants. So how does it happen that, one search done by me on the internet, let's say for purchasing flight tickets, leads to my entire social media being aligned with that? That, for instance, if I open Facebook, there'll be an advertisement relating to flight ticket. If I open Instagram, there'll be something relating to that. So this entire aspect indicates a possibility of digital surveillance, which is being done by most of these companies, which again is questionable considering the fact that the consumers may not have opted for it, or in fact may want an option to opt out of it, which is not available on, or which is not provided by any of these companies. This digital surveillance ends up giving so much information in the hands of these companies that it may lead to a geopolitical hegemony. Because again, most of these companies that we talk about, Google, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, are all companies which exist in either the US or the Europe. And both these have anyway a geopolitical hegemony when we talk about international politics. And this geopolitical hegemony increases with the surveillance mechanism and the possibility of surveillance capitalism coming into picture. So these would be certain specific questionable policies which are undertaken by these global tech giants, which essentially to a very great extent affect the interests of the people and the countries which belong to the global south. Now, what are the ways to deal with these problems, right? The ways in which the countries, the developing and the least developed countries, have tried to deal with this problem of the global tech giants taking too much liberty in their market is by following these policies. For instance, what the developing countries would say is if you want to access our market in order to sell your digital products, you will have to undertake compulsory source code sharing or technology transfer, which means if you want my people to access your website or to access the products which are being sold by a particular company in the global market, that company will have to share with the government certain source code information or technology transfers in order to ensure that the government, which is opening up their markets towards these global tech giants, also gets some benefit out of opening their markets, right? That is one way of dealing with the problem of digital divide or access to technology. The second one is imposition of tariffs on e-commerce. If you put an Amazon versus a local marketplace, a digital marketplace across each other, you would have majority of the consumers preferring Amazon over any other local marketplace for various reasons. However, imposition of tariffs enable the governments to level the playing field to a certain extent by virtue of having some kind of a protected marketplace for domestic or local producers and offerers of services as well. Next way of doing it is data localization, the digital surveillance, which I talked about, how there's a lot of data and information which is being extracted from our countries in other countries by virtue of the functioning of these global tech giants. That can be stopped by having a data localization requirements where the governments would require the data which is being mined of their people to be located, stored, and processed in their own country. The next one is having suitable antitrust policies because of the fact that majority of these global tech giants across the countries, including in developed countries, are being tried for their questionable antitrust practices, which again requires a robust and a well-developed antitrust policy in place to protect the domestic and the local competitors of these big tech giants. Next is data privacy laws, again, because I talked about how there's a dichotomy of protection of IPR versus protection of data. There is a need for active intervention of the government in order to make policies for protection of data of their consumers. And the last one is various other interventionist policies. All of these are policies where the government interferes and makes the company do something, which broadly speaking goes against the principle of liberalization of trade, because liberalization of trade talks about how there should be free trade, which means that there should be least regulations and there should be non-discriminatory trade. Now, all these policies, which can be used in order to protect the interest against the global tech giants, are policies which would not be allowed if a country would agree to liberalized digital trade. Because all of these policies, in a way, create barriers to digital trade. Even though they protect legitimate interests, they do create barriers to international trade, and that is one of the major problems which exist with with any proposal for liberalization of trade without having a balanced proposal for uh, taking into consideration the problems of digital trade as well. So with this, I'd like to end my presentation. Thank you so much.